Sarah Martinez had always been smaller than everyone else. At 5 feet 2 inches, she barely met the height requirements for the Marines, and her slight frame made her look even younger than her 22 years. Standing in the recruitment office 3 years ago, the sergeant had looked her up and down with skeptical eyes before finally handing her the paperwork. She could still remember his words, "The Corps will either make you or break you, little lady." Now, as she walked through the gates of Camp Pendleton for what would be her final assignment before deployment, Sarah carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had already proven herself countless times. Her dress blues were immaculate, every crease sharp enough to cut paper, every medal and ribbon positioned with mathematical precision. But it was the small blue ribbon with white stars nestled among the others that set her apart from every other Marine on base. Most people didn't recognize it immediately, but those who did stopped in their tracks. The Medal of Honor was not something you wore casually. It was the highest military decoration in the United States, awarded for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. Only 3,500 had been awarded since its creation, and fewer than 70 living recipients existed. Sarah Martinez was the youngest, and one of only a handful of women to ever receive it. But, walking across the base that morning, surrounded by fresh-faced recruits and seasoned veterans, she looked like just another young Marine trying to find her place in a world that wasn't always welcoming to people who looked like her. "Hey, check out the tiny Marine," came a voice from behind her. Sarah didn't turn around, but she could hear the group of male recruits following about 20 feet back. "Bet she's lost on her way to the chow hall." Another voice joined in, this one with a thick southern drawl. "Nah, man, look at all those ribbons. She must be some kind of poster girl for diversity recruitment. Probably never seen real combat in her life." Sarah's jaw tightened slightly, but she kept walking. This wasn't anything new. She'd heard variations of these comments since the day she first put on the uniform. Being a Latina woman in the Marines meant constantly having to prove herself, over and over again, to people who assumed she didn't belong. "I'm telling you, Thompson, these affirmative action Marines are ruining the Corps," the first voice continued, louder now, as if he wanted her to hear. "Give them a few participation trophies and, suddenly, they think they're real warriors." The group had closed the distance now, and Sarah could see their reflections in the windows of the buildings she passed. 5 of them, all bigger than her, all looking like they'd stepped out of a recruiting poster. Clean-shaven, broad-shouldered, walking with the swagger of men who'd never had to question whether they belonged somewhere. "Excuse me, Marine," the southern voice called out, and Sarah finally stopped and turned around. The speaker was a tall blond man with the kind of square jaw that suggested he'd been quarterback in high school. His name tape read Davidson. Next to him stood a stocky man with close-cropped dark hair. "Thompson," she assumed. "Yes?" Sarah's voice was steady, professional. Davidson smiled, but there was nothing friendly about it. "We were just wondering what unit you're assigned to. We're heading to 2nd Battalion ourselves, and we like to know who we'll be serving with." "3rd Battalion," Sarah replied simply. "3rd Battalion," Thompson repeated, nudging one of his friends. "Combat unit. Funny, you don't really look like infantry material to me." Sarah felt the familiar fire building in her chest, but she kept her expression neutral. "Appearances can be deceiving." "Oh, I'm sure they can be," Davidson said, his eyes traveling up and down her uniform with obvious disdain. "Tell me, Martinez," he read her name tape with exaggerated care, "what exactly did you do to earn all those pretty ribbons? File paperwork really efficiently? Make really good coffee for the officers?" The other men laughed, and Sarah noticed that their little confrontation was starting to draw attention from other Marines walking by. Some slowed their pace, others stopped entirely, sensing the tension building. "I did my job," Sarah said quietly. "Your job?" Thompson snorted. "Let me guess, you were stationed at some nice safe FOB in Afghanistan, processing supply requests and sending emails home to mommy about how tough military life is." "Something like that," Sarah replied, and, for the first time, there was the hint of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Davidson stepped closer, and Sarah could smell the coffee on his breath. "You know what I think? I think the Marine Corps has gotten soft." They're so worried about looking inclusive that they'll pin medals on anyone who looks good in a recruitment brochure. Meanwhile, real Marines who actually fight, get passed over because they don't check the right boxes. That's an interesting theory, Sarah said, her voice still perfectly calm. It's not a theory, sweetheart, Davidson said, and the condescension in his voice made several of the watching Marines wince. It's reality. The Corps used to mean something. Now they're giving out participation trophies to people like you and calling it valor. The word sweetheart hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah's smile grew a little wider. People like me, she repeated slowly. Yeah, people like you. Short. Female. Probably only joined for the college benefits and never intended to see real action. Davidson was on a roll now, feeding off the laughter of his friends. I bet the closest you've come to combat is watching war movies at the base theater. Staff Sergeant Michael Reynolds was walking back from the motor pool when he heard the commotion. At 43, he'd seen enough young Marines making fools of themselves to know trouble when he heard it. But, when he got close enough to see who was at the center of the crowd, his blood ran cold. Oh, shit, he muttered under his breath, and started moving faster. You know what really gets me? Davidson continued, oblivious to the growing crowd and the fact that several senior NCOs were now paying very close attention to his words. They probably fast-tracked your promotions, too. Diversity hire all the way. Meanwhile, Marines who've actually bled for this country get stuck at the same rank for years because they weren't born with the right chromosomes or skin color. Sarah's smile had disappeared now, replaced by something much more dangerous. You think I haven't bled for this country? I think you've never been in a real fight in your life, Davidson shot back. I think those ribbons on your chest are participation trophies, and I think everyone on this base knows it except you. Staff Sergeant Reynolds was close enough now to see the expression on Sarah's face, and it made his stomach drop. He'd seen that look before, in places where it usually preceded something that ended with body bags and military tribunals. Martinez, he called out, his voice carrying the authority of 15 years in the Corps. Is there a problem here? Davidson turned around, annoyed at the interruption. No problem, Staff Sergeant. Just getting to know our new teammate here. Making sure she knows what's expected of Marines in a combat unit. Reynolds looked at Davidson like he was a particularly stupid piece of equipment that had just malfunctioned. Is that right? And what exactly is expected of Marines in a combat unit, Davidson? Excellence, Staff Sergeant. Competence. The ability to handle yourself in a firefight without getting your brothers killed because you're worried about breaking a nail. There was dead silence now. Even the wind seemed to have stopped blowing. Reynolds looked around at the crowd of Marines, all watching, all waiting to see what would happen next. He recognized several faces, some amused, some uncomfortable, some looking like they wanted to be anywhere else in the world. Davidson, Reynolds said slowly, do you see that ribbon on Marine Martinez's chest? The blue one with the white stars? Davidson glanced over dismissively. Yeah, some kind of commendation ribbon. Probably got it for community service or something. The sound that came out of Reynolds' throat wasn't quite a laugh. Community service. Right. He looked at Sarah, who was standing perfectly still, her hands clasped behind her back, her face a mask of professional composure. Martinez, would you like to explain to these Marines what that ribbon represents? Sarah shook her head slightly. That won't be necessary, Staff Sergeant. Oh, but I think it is necessary, Reynolds insisted. I think it's very necessary. Because apparently we have some Marines here who don't know how to read uniform ribbons properly. He turned to address the entire crowd, his voice carrying across the courtyard. That blue ribbon with white stars is the Medal of Honor. The Congressional Medal of Honor. The highest military decoration in the United States Armed Forces, awarded for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty in actual combat against an enemy of the United States. You could have heard a pin drop. Davidson's face had gone from confident to confused to something approaching panic as the implications sank in. Corporal Martinez received that medal, Reynolds continued, for single-handedly holding off a Taliban assault on her forward operating base in Helmand province for 6 hours after her entire squad was killed or wounded. She sustained multiple gunshot wounds and continued fighting until reinforcements arrived, saving the lives of 14 wounded Marines and preventing sensitive intelligence from falling into enemy hands. Davidson looked like he was going to be sick. Thompson had taken several steps back, as if he could distance himself from what his friend had just done. The other Marines in their group were staring at the ground, suddenly very interested in their boots. She was 20 years old at the time, Reynolds added, almost conversationally. Youngest Medal of Honor recipient since World War II. The president himself put that ribbon on her chest in a ceremony at the White House. CNN called her America's daughter. Time magazine put her on their cover. Sarah still hadn't moved, but something had changed in her posture. She stood a little straighter, and, when she looked at Davidson now, it was with the calm confidence of someone who had faced down much worse than schoolyard bullies. So when you say she looks like she's never been in a real fight, Reynolds said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, what exactly are you basing that assessment on? Davidson opened his mouth, then closed it again. No words came out. And, when you suggest that her ribbons are participation trophies, Reynolds continued, are you referring to the Purple Heart she earned when she took shrapnel in her shoulder? Or maybe the Bronze Star she got for saving a convoy that was about to drive into an IED? Or perhaps the Combat Action Ribbon she earned during her first deployment when she was 19 years old? The silence stretched on. Someone in the crowd coughed. A helicopter passed overhead, its rotors chopping through the air. I asked you a question, Marine, Reynolds said, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. I didn't know, Staff Sergeant, Davidson finally managed. You didn't know, Reynolds repeated. You didn't know because you didn't bother to look. You didn't know because you saw what you expected to see instead of what was actually in front of you. You didn't know because you made assumptions based on her size and her gender and her name, and you never once considered that maybe, just maybe, you might be wrong. Davidson nodded miserably. Do you know what they call Marines who make assumptions in combat situations, Davidson? No, Staff Sergeant. Dead, Reynolds said flatly. They call them dead. Because Marines who don't pay attention to details, Marines who see what they want to see instead of what's actually there, Marines who underestimate their enemies, those Marines don't come home. He turned to look at Sarah, who was still standing at perfect attention. Corporal Martinez, do you have anything you'd like to say to these Marines? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering. When she spoke, her voice was soft but carried clearly across the courtyard. I joined the Marines for the same reasons most of you did. I wanted to serve my country. I wanted to be part of something bigger than myself. I wanted to prove that I was tough enough, strong enough, good enough to wear this uniform. She paused, her eyes moving across the faces in the crowd. I never asked for special treatment. I never wanted anything except the chance to do my job and take care of the Marines to my left and right. Davidson was staring at the ground now, his face flushed with shame. The day I earned this medal, Sarah continued, touching the blue ribbon on her chest, I watched 5 of my friends die. Marines I had trained with, eaten with, shared foxholes with. They died protecting something they believed in, and I would have died right beside them if that's what it took. Her voice never wavered, never rose above a conversational tone, but every word hit like a hammer blow. So when you tell me I don't belong here, when you suggest that I haven't earned my place, you're not just insulting me. You're insulting every Marine who ever bled beside me. You're insulting every Marine who trained me, who trusted me, who counted on me to have their back when everything went to hell. She took a step forward, and Davidson instinctively stepped back. This uniform doesn't care what you look like. These ribbons don't care about your gender or your race or how tall you are. They care about what you've done and how you've done it and whether you were willing to pay the price when the bill came due. The crowd had grown to include nearly 50 Marines now, all listening intently. Some of them were nodding. Others looked like they were seeing their own assumptions in a new light. I don't know what kind of Marines you're going to be, Sarah said, addressing the entire group now. But I hope you'll be better than the assumptions you made about me today. because the Marines to your left and right deserve better. The Corps deserves better. And, frankly, you deserve better than the kind of thinking that led to this conversation. She turned to Reynolds and rendered a perfect salute. Permission to carry on, Staff Sergeant? Reynolds returned the salute. Granted, Corporal. Semper Fi. Semper Fi, Staff Sergeant. Sarah turned and walked away, her back straight, her pace unhurried. The crowd parted as she passed, and more than a few Marines stood a little straighter as she went by. Reynolds waited until she was out of earshot before turning back to Davidson and his group. Gentlemen, he said, his voice conversational again, you have just experienced what we in the Corps like to call a learning opportunity. I suggest you take advantage of it. Davidson finally looked up. What should we do, Staff Sergeant? What you should do, Reynolds said, is figure out how to apologize for what just happened without making it worse. What you should do is spend some time thinking about why you made the assumptions you made and how you can avoid making them again. What you should do is become better Marines than you were 5 minutes ago. He started to walk away, then turned back. And, Davidson? If I ever hear you call another Marine sweetheart in that tone of voice again, you'll be spending the rest of your enlistment cleaning latrines with a toothbrush. Are we clear? Crystal clear, Staff Sergeant. As the crowd began to disperse, the Marines walked away in small groups, their conversations subdued. Some were talking about what they'd just witnessed. Others were clearly reconsidering their own assumptions about the people around them. Davidson and his friends stood alone in the courtyard for several minutes, none of them quite sure what to say. Holy shit, Thompson finally whispered. The Medal of Honor. The youngest recipient since World War II, another one added quietly. Davidson just stood there, staring at the spot where Sarah had been standing. In his mind, he was replaying every word he'd said, every assumption he'd made, every cruel joke he'd laughed at. The weight of it was crushing. What do we do now? Thompson asked. Davidson looked at his friends, then, at the building where Sarah had disappeared. I don't know, he said quietly. But, whatever it is, it's not enough. The story of what happened in that courtyard spread through Camp Pendleton like wildfire. By evening chow, every Marine on base had heard some version of it, and, by the next morning, the details had taken on the kind of mythic quality that military stories often acquire when they're retold enough times. Sarah Martinez tried to go about her business as usual, but she could feel the change in how people looked at her. Before, she'd been invisible, just another young Marine trying to blend in. Now, conversation stopped when she entered a room. Marines she'd never met nodded respectfully as she passed. Some even saluted, though her rank didn't require it. She hated it. The attention, the whispers, the way people suddenly treated her like she was made of glass, it was exactly what she'd been trying to avoid her entire military career. She'd learned long ago that being different meant being watched, and being watched meant every mistake was magnified, every success was questioned, and every moment of normalcy was impossible. 3 days after the confrontation, she was sitting alone in the mess hall when someone cleared their throat behind her. She turned to see Davidson standing there, his hands clasped behind his back, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Corporal Martinez? Could I have a word with you? Sarah studied his face for a moment. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine remorse mixed with crushing embarrassment. Sit down, Davidson. He sat across from her, his untouched meal tray trembling slightly in his hands. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The normal sounds of the mess hall conversations, clinking silverware, chairs scraping across the floor, seemed muffled and distant. I need to apologize, Davidson finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. What I said, what I did, there's no excuse for it. Sarah continued eating her dinner, not looking at him. No, there isn't. Davidson winced. I've been trying to figure out what to say for 3 days. I've started this conversation in my head 100 times, and every time, it sounds inadequate. That's because it is inadequate, Sarah said, still not looking up from her food. You humiliated yourself and disrespected the Corps based on assumptions you made about someone you'd never met. An apology doesn't fix that. I know, Davidson said quickly. I know it doesn't fix anything. But I needed to say it anyway because I need you to know that I'm not. I mean, I don't usually. He trailed off, frustrated by his inability to find the right words. Sarah finally looked up at him. You don't usually what? Act like an ignorant bigot? Because from where I was standing, it seemed like you were pretty comfortable with it. Davidson's face flushed red. That's fair. That's more than fair. But I need you to understand that I've been thinking about this constantly since it happened. About why I said what I said, about where it came from. And what did you figure out? Davidson took a deep breath. I figured out that I'm scared. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Scared of what? Scared of not being good enough. Scared of washing out. Scared of disappointing my family, my unit, myself. He paused, struggling with the words. My dad was a Marine. 2 tours in Vietnam, Purple Heart, Bronze Star. My older brother was a Marine, served 3 tours in Iraq. I've been hearing about Marine Corps excellence my entire life, and now that I'm here, I'm terrified that I won't measure up. Sarah put down her fork. And somehow that justifies attacking me? No, Davidson said quickly. Nothing justifies what I did. But, I think seeing someone who looked so different from what I expected a real Marine to look like, made me feel like maybe the standards weren't as high as I thought they were. Like maybe if you could do it, then it wasn't as special as my dad and brother made it seem. The honesty of it caught Sarah off guard. It was ugly and wrong, but it was real. So you decided to tear me down to make yourself feel better about your own insecurities. Yeah, Davidson said simply. That's exactly what I did. And it was cowardly and stupid and everything a Marine shouldn't be. Sarah studied his face. She could see the shame there, but also something else, a genuine desire to understand, to be better. Davidson, do you know what the worst part about what you did was? He shook his head. It wasn't the insults. I've heard worse. It wasn't the assumption that I didn't belong. I've dealt with that my entire career. She leaned forward slightly. The worst part was that you did it in front of other Marines. You gave them permission to think the same things about me, about women, about anyone who doesn't look like your idea of what a Marine should look like. Davidson's eyes dropped to the table. I didn't think about that. That's the problem. You didn't think. You reacted based on your own fears and prejudices, and you did it publicly. Do you have any idea how much harder you made things for every female Marine on this base? The weight of that hit him visibly. His shoulders sagged. How do I fix it? He asked quietly. You don't, Sarah said bluntly. You can't unfry an egg, Davidson. What you said is out there. Some Marines are going to remember it and think you had a point, even after they found out about my Medal of Honor. Others are going to think you were just stupid enough to say out loud what they were thinking quietly. Davidson looked like he might be sick. But, Sarah continued, you can make sure it doesn't happen again. Not just from you, but from the Marines around you. You can use your voice to call out the same kind of thinking you displayed, instead of participating in it. How? Sarah stood up, gathering her empty tray. That's something you'll have to figure out for yourself. But, here's a starting point. The next time you see a Marine being judged for what they look like instead of what they can do, remember how you felt sitting across from me just now. Remember how small and stupid and ashamed you felt, and ask yourself if that's the kind of Marine you want to be. She started to walk away, then turned back. Davidson? For what it's worth, I believe that you're genuinely sorry. But sorry doesn't mean much if it doesn't change anything. The real test isn't whether you can apologize. It's whether you can become someone who wouldn't need to. After she left, Davidson sat alone in the mess hall for a long time, picking at his food without really eating it. Other Marines came and went around him, their conversations and laughter creating a backdrop of normalcy that felt surreal given the upheaval in his own world. He thought about calling his father, telling him what had happened, asking for advice. But, the more he imagined that conversation, the more he realized that his father's approval had been part of the problem in the first place. He'd been so focused on living up to someone else's idea of what a Marine should be that he'd never stopped to think about what kind of Marine he wanted to be himself. 3 weeks later, Davidson was in the rec room when he overheard two Marines talking about the new female recruits who'd just arrived on base. "I'm telling you, Henderson, they're setting the bar lower for the women. There's no way they're meeting the same physical standards as the men." "Maybe," the other Marine replied. "But, they're here now, so we've got to deal with it." The first Marine, Davidson recognized him as a corporal from 1st Battalion, snorted. "Deal with it? Brother, we shouldn't have to deal with anything. This is supposed to be the Marine Corps, not some college diversity program." Davidson felt his stomach clench. 6 months ago, he would have nodded along or maybe even joined the conversation. The words sounded familiar because they were so close to things he'd thought himself. He looked around the rec room. Several other Marines were within earshot, some nodding in agreement, others looking uncomfortable but staying silent. This was exactly what Sarah had warned him about, the way these attitudes spread when they went unchallenged. "Hey, Corporal Jackson," Davidson said, his voice carrying across the room. "You ever heard of Corporal Sarah Martinez?" Jackson turned around, irritated by the interruption. "No." "Why?" "She's with 3rd Battalion. 5'2", about 120 pounds soaking wet. Medal of Honor recipient." The room got quiet. Jackson looked skeptical. "Medal of Honor? Come on, Davidson. I would have heard about that." Davidson pulled out his phone and did a quick search. "Here," he said, showing Jackson the screen. Time magazine cover. "America's Daughter, the young Marine who held the line. Want to read about how she held off a Taliban assault for 6 hours after her entire squad was killed or wounded?" Jackson took the phone and read in silence. His expression slowly changed from skepticism to surprise to something approaching awe. "Holy shit," he said quietly. "Yeah," Davidson said. "Holy shit. She was 20 years old when she earned that medal. Younger than most of us are now. So when you say the standards are being lowered for women, I'm curious what standards you're talking about. Because it seems to me like some of them might be setting the bar higher than we ever will." Jackson handed the phone back, looking chagrined. "I didn't know." "None of us knew," Davidson said. "That's the point. We make assumptions based on what people look like instead of what they've done. We decide who belongs and who doesn't based on our own limited experience instead of actual facts." He looked around the room at the other Marines. "I was wrong about Corporal Martinez. Dead wrong. And I was wrong in the worst possible way, publicly, loudly, and with absolute confidence. I made an ass of myself and disrespected a genuine American hero because I was too ignorant and too insecure to recognize excellence when it was standing right in front of me." The silence in the room was complete now. Davidson could feel his heart pounding, but he pressed on. "The Marine Corps taught me that I'm supposed to have my brothers' and sisters' backs. All of them. Regardless of what they look like or where they came from or whether they fit my preconceived notions of what a Marine should be. But I can't have their backs if I'm too busy questioning whether they belong here in the first place." He turned back to Jackson. "So maybe instead of worrying about whether standards are being lowered, we should focus on making sure we're meeting the standards ourselves. Because if we're spending our time looking for reasons why other Marines don't measure up, we're probably not spending enough time making sure that we do." Jackson nodded slowly. That's a fair point." "It's not my point," Davidson said. "It's Corporal Martinez's point. She just made it a lot more gracefully than I could." Later that evening, Davidson was walking back to his barracks when he saw Sarah coming out of the base library. She was in civilian clothes, jeans and a simple sweater, and carrying a stack of books. For a moment, she looked like any other college student heading home after a study session. "Corporal Martinez," he called out. She turned and waited for him to catch up. I wanted you to know that I took your advice, he said. About using my voice. Sarah tilted her head slightly. Oh? Davidson told her about the conversation in the rec room, about challenging Jackson's assumptions, about trying to change the culture instead of just apologizing for his part in it. Sarah listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. How did it feel? She asked. Scary, Davidson admitted. But, right. It felt right. Sarah nodded. Good. That means you're learning. They walked in silence for a while, their footsteps echoing off the empty sidewalks. The base was quiet at this hour, most Marines either in their barracks or off base for the evening. Can I ask you something? Davidson said. Sure. Do you ever regret it? Joining the Marines, I mean. Having to deal with people like I was? Sarah considered the question carefully. Sometimes, she said honestly. There are days when I wonder what my life would have been like if I'd chosen something easier. But, then, I remember why I joined in the first place. Which was to be part of something bigger than myself. To serve something worth serving. To prove that I was strong enough and tough enough and good enough to wear this uniform. She smiled slightly. The fact that other people question those things doesn't change whether they're true. Davidson nodded. Do you think I can be that kind of Marine? The kind who makes the Corps better instead of worse? Sarah stopped walking and looked at him directly. Davidson, 3 weeks ago you publicly humiliated yourself and disrespected everything the Marine Corps stands for. Today you stood up to a fellow Marine who was making the same mistakes you made, and you did it with courage and conviction. She paused. What do you think? Davidson felt something shift inside his chest, a small but significant loosening of the knot of shame and self-doubt that had been sitting there since that day in the courtyard. I think I'm learning, he said. Then, you're already better than you were, Sarah replied. And if you're better tomorrow than you are today, and better next week than you are tomorrow, then maybe you'll become the kind of Marine the Corps needs. As they reached the intersection where their paths diverged, Sarah turned to go. Corporal Martinez? Davidson called after her. Yeah. Thank you. For giving me the chance to be better. Sarah looked back at him, this young Marine who was slowly transforming his shame into something more useful. Don't thank me yet, she said. Thank me when you've spent the rest of your career proving that you meant it. 2 months after the courtyard incident, Sarah received orders that would change everything. 3rd Battalion was deploying to Afghanistan, specifically to Forward Operating Base Chapman in Khost Province, one of the most dangerous sectors along the Pakistani border. For Sarah, it would be her 4th deployment to Afghanistan, but her first time returning to combat operations since earning the Medal of Honor. The deployment came with complications she hadn't anticipated. The media attention surrounding her award had made her something of a celebrity in military circles, and the Marine Corps Public Affairs Office had been fielding requests for interviews and features ever since. The last thing she wanted was to be followed by reporters documenting her return to combat, but she understood that her story had become bigger than just her own experience. More concerning was the reaction of some of her new teammates. 3rd Battalion had a mix of veterans and new Marines, and, while the veterans generally treated her with the respect her record had earned, some of the newer Marines seemed either intimidated by her reputation or resentful of the attention it brought. She could see it in the way conversations stopped when she entered a room, the way some of them watched her during training exercises as if waiting for her to prove herself all over again. Davidson, who had requested a transfer to 3rd Battalion after their conversation, was one of the few who treated her normally. If anything, their confrontation had stripped away the pretense between them, leaving behind a working relationship built on mutual respect and hard-earned trust. You nervous about going back? He asked one evening as they cleaned their weapons in the armory. Sarah considered the question. Not nervous exactly. But, it's different this time. How so? She paused in her cleaning to look at him. Last time, I was just another Marine. Nobody knew my name, nobody was watching to see what I'd do. If I screwed up, it reflected on me. Now, Now you're representing every female Marine who comes after you, Davidson finished. Something like that. Sarah went back to cleaning her rifle. The pressure's different. Before, I just had to be good enough to survive and do my job. Now I have to be perfect, because if I'm not, people will say it proves their point about women in combat. Davidson was quiet for a moment, processing that. That's not fair. Fair doesn't factor into it, Sarah said simply. This is the reality of being the exception. You don't just represent yourself, you represent everyone who looks like you, everyone who might come after you. Every success proves that others can succeed. Every failure confirms that none of them should have been given the chance. The weight of that responsibility was something Davidson had never considered. As a white male Marine, his successes and failures were his own. They reflected on him as an individual, not on his entire gender or race. How do you handle that kind of pressure? Sarah shrugged. Same way you handle any other pressure. You focus on your job and do it as well as you can. You take care of your Marines and trust them to take care of you. You remember that everyone who wears this uniform volunteered to put their life on the line for something bigger than themselves. 3 weeks before deployment, 3rd Battalion conducted a final training exercise at the Marine Corps Mountain Warfare Training Center in California. The scenario involved a complex patrol operation in mountainous terrain, with multiple objectives and embedded challenges designed to test everything from small unit tactics to individual decision-making under stress. Sarah was assigned as squad leader for the exercise, a role that placed her in command of 12 Marines, including Davidson. It was the first time she'd led a squad since Afghanistan, and everyone understood that this exercise would be closely watched by the battalion leadership. The mission began before dawn with a grueling 12-mile movement through terrain that seemed designed to break spirits and twist ankles. Sarah set a steady pace that was aggressive but sustainable, stopping every few hours to check her Marines and ensure that no one was falling behind. Davidson, carrying the squad's radio in addition to his own gear, found himself impressed by the quiet competence with which Sarah led. She didn't waste words or energy on unnecessary commands, but she missed nothing, checking map coordinates with the precision of someone who understood that a few degrees of error could mean the difference between finding the objective and walking into an ambush. "Squad leader, this is base," came the voice over the radio around midday. "Be advised, you have enemy movement approximately 1 click northeast of your position." Sarah took the handset from Davidson. "Base, this is squad leader. Requesting permission to adjust course to avoid contact." "Negative, squad leader. Your timeline is fixed. You need to reach objective Alpha before 1,500 hours." Sarah checked her map and GPS objective Alpha was still 6 kilometers away through rough terrain, and the direct route would take them within a few hundred meters of the reported enemy position. They could go around, but that would add at least an hour to their movement time. She called her Marines together and laid out the situation. "We can take the long way and risk missing our timeline, or we can move through the danger area and risk contact. Either way carries consequences." "What do you think, Corporal?" asked Lance Corporal Williams, a veteran of 2 deployments who'd initially been skeptical about serving under a female squad leader. Sarah studied the map for another moment, considering the tactical situation. In training exercises, there were always multiple right answers, but, in real combat, there was often only one choice that brought everyone home alive. "We're going through," she decided. "But, we're going to do it smart. Davidson, you and Johnson will take point and establish overwatch positions here and here." She pointed to 2 locations on the map that would give them good fields of fire. "Williams, you'll take the rifle team around the eastern approach. I'll take the assault team through the center. If there's contact, we bound forward by teams until we can break contact or neutralize the threat." It was an aggressive plan, but a sound one. More importantly, it showed the kind of tactical thinking that distinguished experienced combat leaders from Marines who were still learning the difference between following procedures and making decisions. The movement went flawlessly until they were about halfway through the danger area. Davidson, scanning through his scope from the overwatch position, spotted movement in the tree line ahead. "Squad leader, this is Overwatch. I've got eyes on 4 enemy personnel, approximately 200 meters northeast of your position. Sarah's response came back immediately. Can you identify weapons? Affirmative. I see what looks like 2 rifles and, possibly an RPG. The tactical situation had just become significantly more complex. In a real firefight, an RPG could devastate an entire squad if they were caught in the open. Sarah had to make a decision that would either demonstrate sound tactical judgment or expose her Marines to unnecessary risk. All stations, this is squad leader. We're going to initiate contact on my command. Overwatch teams, you have priority targets on the rifle-carrying personnel. Assault team, we're going to bound forward in 3-second rushes. Williams, move your team to cut off their escape route to the east. What followed was a textbook example of small unit tactics executed under pressure. Sarah's Marines moved with precision and coordination, each element supporting the others as they closed with and eliminated the simulated enemy force. The entire engagement lasted less than 5 minutes, and, when it was over, the exercise controllers confirmed that all objectives had been achieved with no simulated casualties. But, it wasn't the tactical execution that impressed the observing instructors, it was the leadership they witnessed. Sarah had remained calm under pressure, made sound decisions quickly, and maintained control of a complex tactical situation involving multiple moving parts. More importantly, her Marines had responded with the kind of trust and confidence that only came when subordinates believed in their leader's competence. After the exercise, Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, the battalion commander, called Sarah to his office. "Outstanding work out there, Corporal Martinez," he said without preamble. "Your squad's performance was exemplary, and your leadership under pressure was exactly what I want to see from my squad leaders." "Thank you, sir." Morrison leaned back in his chair. "I want to talk to you about something. As you know, we're going to be operating in some challenging terrain in Afghanistan. I need squad leaders who can think independently, make tough decisions, and maintain the confidence of their Marines under extreme stress." Sarah nodded, sensing that this conversation was heading somewhere significant. "I'm recommending you for promotion to sergeant," Morrison continued. "The promotion would be effective immediately upon deployment, which would make you one of the youngest squad leaders in the battalion. It would also make you the first female squad leader in 3rd Battalion's history." The implications of that weren't lost on Sarah. Being the first anything came with additional scrutiny and pressure, as she'd learned repeatedly throughout her career. "Sir, I appreciate the confidence, but I have to ask, is this recommendation based on my performance, or on the publicity value of having a Medal of Honor recipient leading a squad?" Morrison's expression hardened slightly. "Corporal, if I were interested in publicity, I would have assigned you to the public affairs section and had you give speeches to recruits. I'm recommending you for promotion because you're a proven combat leader who can think under pressure and maintain the trust of your Marines. The fact that you happen to be a Medal of Honor recipient is relevant only insofar as it demonstrates that you've already been tested under the most extreme circumstances possible." Sarah considered this. The promotion would be a significant step forward in her career, but it would also make her an even more visible target for anyone looking to prove that women couldn't handle combat leadership roles. "Sir, what about the other squad leaders? How do they feel about the possibility of a female sergeant in the company?" Morrison smiled grimly. "Some of them are fine with it. Others have expressed concerns. But, you know what, Corporal? Their concerns are irrelevant. This is the Marine Corps, not a democracy. I assign leaders based on competence and performance, not on popularity polls." He leaned forward across his desk. "Here's what I know about you, Martinez. You've been tested in combat in ways that most of these Marines can't even imagine. You've proven that you can lead under pressure, make life or death decisions, and sacrifice yourself for your subordinates. Those aren't male or female characteristics, they're Marine characteristics." Sarah felt the familiar weight of expectations settling on her shoulders. Every advancement, every opportunity, came with the understanding that she wasn't just representing herself. "I accept the recommendation, sir." "Good." Morrison stood up and extended his hand. "Congratulations, Sergeant Martinez. Don't make me regret it." As Sarah left the colonel's office, she reflected on how much had changed since that day in the courtyard when Davidson and his friends had questioned whether she belonged in the Marine Corps. Now she was being entrusted with the lives of Marines heading into one of the most dangerous combat environments in the world. That evening, she found Davidson in the common area of their barracks, reading a letter from home. "How'd it go with the colonel?" he asked, looking up from his letter. "I got promoted to sergeant." Davidson's face broke into a genuine smile. "That's outstanding. Congratulations." "Thanks." Sarah sat down across from him. "You know what this means, right?" "Yeah," Davidson said. "It means I'm going to be taking orders from someone who's proven she can handle anything the enemy throws at us." Sarah looked at him carefully. "Are you going to be okay with that? Taking orders from the Marine you called unqualified 3 months ago?" Davidson folded his letter and met her eyes. "Sarah, can I call you Sarah when we're not on duty?" She nodded. 3 months ago, I was an ignorant kid who thought I knew what a Marine looked like. I measured people against my own limited experience instead of looking at what they'd actually accomplished." He paused. "If you can trust me enough to have me in your squad after what I said to you, then I can damn sure trust your judgment enough to follow your orders." It was, Sarah thought, a remarkably mature response from someone who'd shown such poor judgment just a few months earlier. People could change, could grow beyond their initial prejudices and assumptions. It gave her hope not just for Davidson, but for the Marine Corps as a whole. Besides, Davidson added with a slight grin, "It's not like I have a choice. You're my squad leader now. I follow your orders whether I like them or not." "True," Sarah said. "But it's easier to lead Marines who believe in what you're doing rather than Marines who are just following orders because they have to." "Then, it's a good thing I believe in what you're doing," Davidson said simply. 2 weeks later, 3rd Battalion loaded onto transport planes at March Air Reserve Base for the long flight to Afghanistan. As the plane lifted off into the California sunshine, Sarah looked around at her Marines, some sleeping, some reading, some staring out the windows at the landscape falling away below them. In a few hours, they would land at Bagram Air Base, and from there they would fly to Forward Operating Base Chapman to begin what would likely be the most challenging deployment of their careers. Some of them were combat veterans, others had never heard a shot fired in anger. All of them had volunteered to put their lives on the line for something they believed in. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to rest, knowing that the next few months would test everything she'd learned about leadership, combat, and what it meant to be a Marine. The weight of command sat heavily on her shoulders, but it was a weight she'd earned the right to carry. In the seat next to her, Davidson was also trying to sleep, but his mind kept returning to a conversation he'd had with his father the night before deployment. "You're really going to follow orders from a woman?" his father had asked, not bothering to hide his skepticism. "Dad," Davidson had replied, "I'm going to follow orders from a Medal of Honor recipient who's forgotten more about combat than I'll ever know. The fact that she happens to be a woman is irrelevant." His father had been quiet for a long moment. "When did you get so smart?" "When I stopped being so stupid," Davidson had answered. Now, flying through the darkness toward a war zone, Davidson reflected on how much his life had changed since that day in the courtyard. He was still the same person in many ways, but his understanding of what it meant to be a Marine had fundamentally shifted. Excellence came in many forms, and courage wasn't limited to people who looked like his preconceived notions of what a warrior should be. As the plane flew through the night toward Afghanistan, both Sarah and Davidson were thinking about the challenges ahead. Neither of them could know that the deployment would test not just their individual courage and competence, but the strength of the bonds they'd built and the lessons they'd learned about what it truly meant to have each other's backs when everything went wrong. Forward Operating Base Chapman sat in a valley surrounded by mountains that seemed to touch the sky. The base itself was a collection of concrete barriers, prefabricated buildings, and guard towers connected by dusty roads that turned to mud when it rained. It was Sarah's 4th time in Afghanistan, but her first time at Chapman, and the base felt different from her previous deployments, smaller, more isolated, and definitely more dangerous. The Taliban controlled much of the surrounding terrain, and rocket attacks were common enough that the Marines had developed an almost casual attitude toward the incoming alarm. The real threat, however, came from the network of mountain trails that allowed enemy fighters to move freely between Pakistan and Afghanistan, using the rough terrain to avoid detection and coordinate attacks on coalition forces. Sergeant Sarah Martinez had been at Chapman for 6 weeks when the call came, and that would define her deployment and change the lives of everyone in her squad. It was early morning, barely light enough to see the mountains that ringed the base, when the radio crackled to life in the Tactical Operations Center. Chapman Base, this is Reaper 6. We have a situation developing approximately 15 clicks northwest of your position. Convoy of Afghan National Army troops has been ambushed and is requesting immediate assistance. Heavy casualties reported. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison was in the TOC within minutes, studying the map and assessing the tactical situation. The ambush site was in a valley that had seen increased Taliban activity over the past month, and intelligence suggested that the enemy force responsible was significantly larger than the small groups they'd been dealing with. "Sir," said the operations officer, "the ANA commander is reporting at least 40 Taliban fighters with RPGs and heavy machine guns. His convoy is immobilized and taking heavy fire." Morrison considered the options. The ambush site was in difficult terrain that would require a careful approach, and the size of the enemy force suggested this was a well-planned operation rather than an opportunistic attack. But 40 Afghan soldiers were trapped and taking casualties, and the Marine Corps didn't abandon its allies. "Get me 3rd Platoon," he ordered. "Full combat load, ready to move in 30 minutes. 25 minutes later, Sarah's squad was loaded into mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles and rolling out of Chapman's gates. The convoy consisted of 4 RAPs carrying 30 Marines, plus support vehicles with additional ammunition and medical supplies. Sarah rode in the lead vehicle with her squad, mentally reviewing the intelligence briefing they'd received before departing. The ambush site was in a valley known locally as the Devil's Throat, a narrow passage between 2 ridgelines that had been the scene of numerous attacks over the years. The Taliban forces were reportedly positioned on both sides of the valley, using the high ground to rain fire down on the trapped ANA convoy below. "Radio check," Sarah called out over the squad comm system as they approached the valley entrance. "Johnson, good copy. Williams, good copy. Davidson, good copy." Each of her Marines acknowledged in turn, their voices calm despite the circumstances. These were combat veterans now, seasoned by 6 weeks of operations in one of Afghanistan's most dangerous provinces. They trusted their equipment, their training, and each other. "Remember," Sarah said as they neared the objective, "we're going in to provide cover for the ANA withdrawal. Our job is to suppress the enemy long enough for them to get their wounded out and break contact. We're not here to win the war, we're here to save lives." The first sign of trouble came when they reached the valley entrance and found the road blocked by a massive boulder that hadn't been there the day before. The convoy ground to a halt as the lead vehicle's commander assessed the situation. "This is 7 Actual," came the platoon commander's voice over the radio. "Road is blocked. Switching to alternate route." But, as they attempted to maneuver around the obstacle, the valley erupted in gunfire. Muzzle flashes sparked from positions all along both ridgelines as Taliban fighters opened up with rifles, machine guns, and rocket-propelled grenades. The Marines had driven straight into a carefully prepared kill zone. "Contact front." Sarah yelled into her radio as bullets began pinging off the armored hull of their MRAP. "Contact left and right. We're taking fire from multiple positions." The vehicle commander was already returning fire with the turret-mounted machine gun, but the enemy positions were well concealed and protected by natural cover. Sarah's vehicle shuddered as an RPG detonated against the side armor, the explosion loud enough to make her ears ring even through her helmet. "Squad, dismount and take cover," Sarah ordered. "Johnson's team, move to that depression at 2 o'clock. Williams, take your team around to the left and see if you can get an angle on those machine gun positions." Her Marines poured out of the vehicle and immediately began returning fire, each team moving with the practiced coordination of unit that had trained together extensively. But, even as they established defensive positions, Sarah could see that they were in serious trouble. The Taliban had obviously spent considerable time preparing this ambush. Their fighting positions were expertly camouflaged and mutually supporting, allowing them to maintain devastating crossfire on anyone caught in the valley below. Worse, the blocked road meant the Marines couldn't retreat quickly, and the rough terrain made it impossible to call in close air support without risk of friendly fire. 7 Actual, this is Martinez, Sarah called over the radio. We need to get out of this kill zone. The enemy has interlocking fields of fire from elevated positions, and we're sitting ducks down here. Copy that, Martinez. Can you identify the primary threats? Sarah scanned the ridgelines through her rifle scope, trying to pick out individual enemy positions from the muzzle flashes and dust clouds. There, a heavy machine gun position about halfway up the eastern ridge that was pouring fire onto the ANA convoy. And there, another one on the western ridge that was covering the roadblock. I caught at least 2 heavy machine guns and multiple small arms positions, she reported. They've got us in a crossfire with nowhere to go. The situation deteriorated rapidly. One of the MRAPs took a direct hit from an RPG and caught fire, forcing its crew to bail out under heavy enemy fire. Several Marines were wounded in the first few minutes of the engagement, and it became clear that they couldn't sustain their current position much longer. That's when Sarah made the decision that would define her leadership and test everything she'd learned about courage under fire. Davidson, she called over the squad radio. I need you to take the squad and provide covering fire for the wounded. Get them back to the casualty collection point and coordinate with the corpsmen. What about you? Davidson responded, already moving toward the wounded Marines. I'm going to take out that machine gun nest. Even over the radio, she could hear the alarm in Davidson's voice. Negative, Sergeant. That's suicide. The position is too well protected and you don't have support. Sarah was already moving, low-crawling through the rocks and debris that littered the valley floor. I've got support, she said. I've got all of you covering my movement. What she was proposing was tactically insane and personally suicidal. The machine gun position was approximately 200 meters away, up a steep slope, and protected by natural cover that would require her to get within grenade range to neutralize. Under normal circumstances, such an assault would require an entire fire team with supporting elements and overwhelming firepower. But these weren't normal circumstances. The Taliban position was decimating both the Marine and ANA forces, and someone had to do something before the entire operation collapsed into a catastrophic withdrawal under fire. All stations, this is Martinez, Sarah called over the radio as she began her movement up the slope. I'm moving on the eastern machine gun position. I need continuous suppressive fire on my target, and I need someone to watch my back trail for flanking movement. Martinez, this is 7 Actual, came the platoon commander's voice. Negative on that movement. I say again, negative. Return to your position immediately. Sarah ignored the order and kept moving. In combat, there were times when following orders meant watching good Marines die, and this was one of those times. Sometimes leadership meant making the hard choice that no one else was willing to make. Davidson, do you have eyes on my target? She called. Affirmative. I can see the muzzle flashes. But, Sarah, please don't do this. There has to be another way. There is no other way, Sarah replied simply. Just keep them busy while I get close enough to make this work. The movement up the slope was the longest 200 meters of her life. Every step exposed her to enemy fire from multiple directions, and she could feel bullets whipping past her head as she bounded from rock to rock, always moving, never staying in one place long enough for the enemy to zero in on her position. Behind her, her Marines were pouring suppressive fire onto the Taliban positions, their disciplined volleys forcing the enemy fighters to keep their heads down and disrupting their ability to coordinate their defense. It was exactly the kind of tactical coordination that separated professional soldiers from amateur fighters. 50 meters from the target, Sarah could see the machine gun position clearly. 3 Taliban fighters were crammed into a natural depression between 2 large boulders, their PKM machine gun pointed down into the valley where it had been wreaking havoc on the coalition forces. They were so focused on their targets below that they hadn't noticed her movement up the slope behind them. Sarah pulled the pins on 2 fragmentation grenades and counted off the seconds. At this range, she would have to get the grenades exactly right, too short and they'd roll back down the slope, too long and the enemy would have time to take cover. "Frag out," she yelled into her radio, and threw both grenades in quick succession. The explosions came 3 seconds apart, the concussion echoing off the valley walls like thunder. When the smoke cleared, the machine gun position was silent. But Sarah's victory was short-lived. As she started to move back down the slope, she heard the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar rounds. The Taliban had obviously called in indirect fire support, and they were targeting the exact slope she was on. "Incoming," she screamed into her radio, throwing herself behind the nearest boulder as the first mortar round exploded 20 meters to her left. The barrage lasted for 3 minutes that felt like 3 hours. Mortar rounds rained down on the slope, throwing up clouds of rock and dirt, some close enough to shower her with debris. When it finally stopped, Sarah's ears were ringing so loudly she could barely hear her own thoughts. "Martinez, report," came Davidson's frantic voice over the radio. "I'm alive," Sarah called back, checking herself for wounds. "But I'm pinned down up here." That mortar fire came from somewhere on the western ridge. "Copy that. We're moving to provide support." "Negative," Sarah said immediately. "Stay with the wounded and maintain your positions. I'll find my own way down." But, as she started to move, Sarah realized that the tactical situation had changed dramatically. The elimination of the machine gun position had allowed the ANA forces to begin withdrawing their wounded, but the Taliban were now repositioning to prevent the Marines from following suit. She could see enemy fighters moving along both ridgelines, apparently trying to surround the valley and trap the coalition forces inside. "All stations, this is Martinez," she called over the radio. "I've got eyes on enemy movement along both ridges. It looks like they're trying to close the back door." "Copy that," came the platoon commander's voice. "Can you disrupt their movement?" Sarah assessed her position and ammunition. She had 1 magazine left for her rifle, plus 2 fragmentation grenades. Not much to work with, but perhaps enough to buy her Marines the time they needed to get the wounded out of the valley. "I can try," she said. "But you need to start moving the wounded now. This position won't be tenable much longer." What followed was a running gun battle that lasted nearly an hour. Sarah moved from position to position along the eastern ridge, using her knowledge of small unit tactics to disrupt the Taliban's attempts to coordinate their assault. She couldn't stop them, but she could slow them down, force them to take cover, make them think twice about exposing themselves to move. Meanwhile, down in the valley, her Marines were executing a textbook fighting withdrawal. Davidson had taken command of the squad in her absence and was coordinating with the other Marine units to establish a defensive perimeter around the wounded while they waited for helicopter evacuation. "Martinez, this is Davidson," came his voice over the radio. "Medevac is inbound, ETA 15 minutes. We need you back down here." Sarah looked around her position. She was running low on ammunition and the Taliban were getting closer. Soon they would have enough forces in position to overrun her location entirely. "I'm coming down," she said. "Prepare to cover my movement." The trip back down the slope was even more harrowing than the trip up had been. The Taliban were now actively hunting for her, and she could hear them calling to each other in Pashto as they coordinated their search. Several times she had to detour around enemy positions, and twice she narrowly avoided walking into ambushes. But her Marines were covering her movement with precision fire, and their discipline under pressure gave her the confidence to keep moving even when the situation seemed hopeless. This was what the Marine Corps was supposed to be about, Marines taking care of Marines, regardless of the odds or the circumstances. When she finally made it back to the squad's position, Davidson grabbed her by the shoulders and looked her up and down for wounds. "Are you hit?" he asked. "I'm fine," Sarah said, though she was breathing hard and covered in dust and debris. "What's the status on the wounded?" 6 Marines wounded, 2 serious but stable. The ANA had 12 casualties including 3 Kia. Medevac is 3 minutes out. Sarah nodded and immediately took charge of the defensive perimeter, positioning her Marines to provide security for the helicopter landing zone. The Taliban were still pressing their attack from multiple directions, but the arrival of close air support had finally begun to tip the tactical balance in favor of the coalition forces. When the medevac helicopters finally arrived, they did so under heavy enemy fire. Sarah's Marines provided covering fire as the wounded were loaded aboard, each of them exposed to enemy fire but none of them wavering in their duty to protect their fallen brothers. As the helicopters lifted off with their precious cargo, Sarah felt a profound sense of relief. They'd accomplished their mission, the ANA forces had been evacuated, the wounded were on their way to medical treatment, and none of her Marines had been killed. But their ordeal wasn't over yet. The Taliban still controlled most of the surrounding terrain, and the Marines would have to fight their way out of the valley under continued pressure from a determined enemy force. "All right, Marines," Sarah called out as they prepared to begin their own withdrawal. "We're going home, but we're not running. We're going to move by bounds, maintain security, and make sure everyone gets out of here alive. Davidson, take point. Williams, you've got rear security. Everyone stays alert and everyone stays together." The fighting withdrawal took another 2 hours, but Sarah's Marines executed it flawlessly. They moved as a unit, covering each other's movement and maintaining discipline under fire. When they finally reached the safety of their vehicles, Sarah felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with her own actions and everything to do with the Marines she had the privilege to lead. The ride back to Forward Operating Base Chapman was quiet, each Marine lost in his own thoughts about what had just happened. They'd been tested under the most extreme circumstances possible, and they'd proven that the training, the preparation, and the bonds they'd formed were strong enough to carry them through. 3 days later, Sarah was called to Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's office. She expected to be debriefed about the operation, possibly counseled about disobeying orders during the engagement. What she didn't expect was to find a general officer waiting for her. "Sergeant Martinez," Morrison said as she entered the office, "I'd like you to meet Brigadier General Sarah Chen, Commanding General of Marine Forces Afghanistan." Sarah snapped to attention and rendered a sharp salute. "Ma'am." General Chen returned the salute and gestured for Sarah to sit down. "Sergeant, I've read the after-action reports from your engagement 3 days ago. I've also interviewed several of your Marines and reviewed the recommendations from your chain of command." Sarah waited, unsure where this conversation was headed. "Your actions during that engagement were extraordinary," General Chen continued. "Your decision to neutralize the machine gun position, while tactically questionable from a risk standpoint, was operationally brilliant. Your leadership under pressure and your willingness to sacrifice yourself for your Marines exemplified everything we expect from Marine leaders." "Thank you, ma'am. I'm recommending you for the Silver Star," General Chen said. "It will be your second Valor Award, which puts you in very rare company indeed." Sarah felt a familiar mix of pride and discomfort. Awards were important, but they also brought attention that she'd learned to be wary of. "Ma'am, I appreciate the recognition, but I was just doing my job. Every Marine in that valley was willing to make the same sacrifice." General Chen smiled. "That's exactly what makes you an exceptional leader, Sergeant. You don't see your actions as exceptional because you don't see yourself as separate from your Marines. But leadership isn't just about personal courage, it's about inspiring others to achieve more than they thought possible." She paused, looking directly at Sarah. "I spoke with Corporal Davidson yesterday. He told me something interesting. He said that 6 months ago, he questioned whether you belonged in the Marine Corps. Now he says he can't imagine serving with anyone else." Sarah glanced at Morrison, who was smiling slightly. "That kind of transformation doesn't happen by accident," General Chen continued. "It happens because leaders like you prove, day after day, that excellence isn't about what you look like or where you came from. It's about what you're willing to do when everything is on the line." As Sarah left the general's office, she reflected on the long journey that had brought her to this point. From that day in the courtyard when Davidson had questioned her place in the Corps, to leading Marines in combat in one of the most dangerous places on Earth, she'd learned that respect wasn't something you demanded, it was something you earned, one decision at a time, one challenge at a time, one moment of courage at a time. Davidson was waiting for her outside the building. "How'd it go?" he asked. "Good," Sarah said simply. "Really good." They walked together toward the chow hall, two Marines who traveled very different paths to reach the same understanding about what it meant to serve, to lead, and to have each other's backs when it mattered most. "You know," Davidson said as they walked, "I never properly thanked you for giving me the chance to be better than I was." Sarah looked at him and smiled. "You don't need to thank me for that. You did the hard work of changing yourself. I just showed you what was possible." "Still," Davidson said, "I want you to know that serving with you has been the honor of my military career." They reached the chow hall and paused before going inside. "Davidson," Sarah said, "remember that first day when you told me to go home?" "Yeah," Davidson said, wincing slightly at the memory. "Well," Sarah said with a grin, "I am going home. We all are. But we're going home as Marines who proved that the Corps is strong enough to embrace anyone willing to live up to its standards, regardless of what they look like or what anyone expects from them." As they walked into the chow hall together, Sarah thought about the letter she would write to her family that evening. She would tell them about the engagement, about her Marines, about the pride she felt in wearing the uniform and leading the kind of Marines the Corps needed. But, mostly, she would tell them that she'd found her place in the world, and that place wasn't defined by the doubts of others or the limitations they tried to impose. It was defined by her willingness to serve something bigger than herself, and to prove, every single day, that she belonged exactly where she was.